Joining us now is Mayumi Tsutakawa. She is an independent writer and editor. She has several books to her credit, including The Forbidden Stitch, Asian American Women's Literary Anthology, which won the American Book Award. She's also been a history speaker for Humanities of Washington, and she was a principal researcher and writer for the American Institute of Architects exhibition Sanctuary Designed for Belonging, Exploring Forms of Sanctuary Cities. So welcome, Mayumi. Good to have you with us.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be with Chino and Chicano.
Well, we're happy to have you here. Let's start with your mother. I mean, when we did the opening here, we talked about your father, who's quite well known, George Tsutakawa, your brothers, who are also artists, but your mom, was she an artist?
Well, I like that you brought this up because often in my dad's shadow, she was the supporter and the bookkeeper and the manager and the mother of four crazy children who were all born very close in age. And we had a large house in the Mount Baker area with my dad's studio, and he was creating art and so on. She actually had a very interesting background that I'm trying to research for a project right now. She was born Kibei, which means born in the US, raised in Japan, and came back to the US. So her orientation was very Japanese.
What was your mother's name?
Ayame Iwasa. Ayame means iris. Oh. And her mother was quite the entrepreneur, a very aggressive immigrant lady who, this is probably the reason that a lot of immigrants send their kids back to the old country to be raised by relatives. She was a very busy restaurateur in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, in the 1920s and 30s. So anyway, my mom received a lot of classical Japanese training in Japan, and also when she moved back, by then the family moved to Sacramento.
So what was the age range? At what age did she go back to Japan?
She was sent with her toddler brother when she was 18 months old, and she came back when she was maybe 14 and arrived back home. Her own father had taken off, was gone. She only saw him once more in her lifetime, and she had then a stepfather and a new city, meaning Sacramento, to get used to. And so she was a young teen when she came back.
So she basically grew up in Japan. So how did she learn? At what point did she learn English?
Well, she had to learn English because she went to school in Sacramento. Her mother was very protective, and she was a great, a very advanced student in the Japanese buyo, which means the Japanese traditional dance. So she, as part of that, she learned to play the instruments, koto and shamisen, and she was a dancer, which followed through to when she and her family were sent to Tule Lake. She was one of the top performers on the stage that they built at Tule Lake for the Japanese classical music performances.
And Tule Lake is where she was interned along with others that were during that time of when Japanese Americans were sent to the camps.
Well, yeah, but the Tule Lake was very different in that it held, especially in the latter part of the war, the most Kibeis, the most people who were literally still loyal to Japan, to the Japanese emperor. My mom said that they figured out, they had the radios where they would hear radio broadcasts in the middle of the night from Japan. And they thought that Japan was going to win the war.
Whoa. Really? So Tule Lake was, basically all the camps were prisons, but this was the high security prison, Tule Lake, of them all.
That's correct. That's correct.
And was that because of the people that were still loyal to Japan?
Yeah, and at a certain point, the midpoint of the war, there was a questionnaire sent to all of those imprisoned, and all of those that stated that they would not be loyal to the US president were sent then to Tule Lake. So there were a lot of dissidents. In fact, there were some really, really radical and militant dissidents, anti-US dissidents in that camp. But you got to figure there's 17,000. It was the biggest camp then by that point. And there were so many internees that basically the dissidents were held off in one area, sort of a prison within a prison. And then the others were just trying to carry on their lives in the camp.
And in the camp is where your mother and father met? Or had they met before?
No, they met in the camp. This is sort of an interesting point. My dad had was drafted, being a Nisei. He was actually also a Kibei, but he was a Nisei and he was college educated. So he was completely bilingual, English and Japanese. He was drafted to the US Army and actually trained with the 442, but he was a lot older than the other young Army recruits of the 442nd and Japanese American battalion. And he was quite ill by the time that they shipped out. So eventually the camp officials discovered that he is bilingual, and he was sent to join the Military Intelligence Service, teaching Japanese language at Fort Snelling in St. Paul, Minnesota.
But your father was born in Seattle.
My dad was born in Seattle.
Okay.
But the thing about how they met is that he was traveling to the different camps on his furloughs in his US Army uniform on the trains. And he went to Tule Lake to visit his sister, Sadako Moriguchi, who became the matriarch of the entire Uwajimaya
clan, empire,
nation, the Uwajimaya nation.
Yeah, right. Wow.
But so they're all my cousins. But so she, Mrs. Moriguchi's husband, Fujimatsu Moriguchi, had been a merchant in Tacoma before the war, as had my mother's stepfather. So they knew each other, and so their meeting was arranged, and they met one time in the camp. And my mom claims that she was an old maid because she was 24. Really an old maid. But at any rate, he did propose to her in a letter that he sent to her after he met her.
Wow.
Well, she was still in the camp.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
She was still in the camp. In fact, after the war was over, her mother went back to Sacramento to open yet another store. It was a little cafe called the Iris Grill. You know, my mother's name was Iris. And my mom went back with her to Sacramento and worked in the Iris Grill, where she met a lot of the returning Nisei vets who had been shipped back from Europe because they were based someplace near Sacramento. But she met a lot of them. And finally, her mom said, "You better go to Seattle and get married because your husband is waiting for you."
Now, were you telling us that, was it your grandmother, your mother's mother, had some kind of shady business dealings? Was that the person that you were?
No, she didn't. She didn't. But her husband, Mr. Not Fujimatsu, but anyway, Mr. Kiyotani in Tacoma, we think, some of us amongst the cousins think that he and other distant relatives were bootleggers. But, you know, when you think about the Japanese culture, it's impossible to have any ceremony whatsoever without sake. I mean, sake is a lifeblood and a ceremonial material. And it wouldn't surprise me at all that they could make sake. Right. So, I mean, that might be part of the rumor.
This is just great.
So, okay, so then
Great.
when did your father find his vocation of being a sculptor, an artist, out of all this?
He actually was talented in art from a young age. And when he was growing up in Japan, so he lived there from the age of 7 to 17. He was born in Seattle, on Capitol Hill. His father was actually a successful merchant import-export company man. And he was born and lived on Capitol Hill up until the age of 7. So when he went to Japan, he was raised by 2 different sets of grandparents, and his mother's family was actually a fairly high up family in the Fukuyama area. In fact, they were related to they worked for the daimyo in the samurai era. They were the gatekeepers of the castle. So between his 2 sets of grandparents, because he didn't really like school, remember this is a very militarist Japan, he didn't like school, and he became trained in all of the Japanese classical arts. So he studied pottery and flower arranging and tea ceremony, and he was a very good art student even from the time of being a teenager. So when he came up to the age of about 16, 17, he told his father that he wouldn't join the family company. So his father said, okay, you go back to America by yourself right now. So at the age of 16, he was disowned and came back to Seattle and kind of made it on his own, working for an uncle that had a produce stand at 12th and Jackson. He lived behind the produce stand, but he went to school at Broadway High School, where they had some really excellent art teachers. And then he went on to the UW, and he was an art student. And so he was talented from a young age.
Wow. Now, what was the family business in Japan? Did I miss that?
They were import-export people, but it's been said that a number of the import-export people from Japan in the United States on the West Coast were actually trading in scrap metal to send back to Japan for the war effort. Now, I don't have this written down, but our relatives in Japan agree to this. And so, I mean, they were military contractors. They were making some money.
Right.
So, but at the same time, they were also bringing Japanese goods to Seattle, you know, miso and shoyu and rice and tea and things that the Japanese immigrant farmers and settlers and stores in the International District in Japantown, things they really needed. So he brought a lot of the Japanese goods to Seattle, and their first store was located over there on Maynard and Dearborn. I believe that's where it was located.
Now, your mother and father, since it was an arranged marriage, I mean, did they fall in love? Did they, you know?
I have to say yes. They had a very long, successful marriage.
Yeah.
She was so able to see where her talents were needed, and along the way, she became his great supporter. And as he became more successful, had art shows, exhibitions, commissions of fountain sculptures, she was always ready to play the supporter and to be the great hostess of visitors to the house. We met so many. I was so lucky to meet the great traditional artists of Japan. Shoji Hamada, the living national treasure ceramic artist, Manzo Nomura of the Kyogen family fame, George Nakashima and Isamu Noguchi. These people came to our house. And of course, we were friends with the Seattle Asian artists, such as Paul Horiuchi and Fei Chong and Andrew Chin and James Washington Jr. And later, Jacob Lawrence. They were all our really good friends. And we 4 kids, myself and my 3 brothers, were able to really learn a lot during that.
Wow. I want to get back to the whole notion of the Kibei, that whole thing. So is that a traditional kind of Japanese thing where you send your kids back to Japan and they come back to the US? Did it predate the war? Because I know a lot of them got kind of caught up during the war.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a traditional thing, but I think that with people, for example, families from Mexico, it's a matter of practicality. When you're working here, working a couple jobs you and your husband and your extended relatives who live with you, it is not unusual to send the kids back to the old country to be raised by your relatives, and they would not only have someone to take care of them, but they would also learn the language and the traditional ways. And that was important to the Japanese, that their kids, keep up the language and the traditional ways. Now, in my research, or what I'm planning on writing, I want to show the contrast between the Kibei young men and women who went to Japan, came back, they were just like Japanese citizens, and the American Niseis who never went to Japan. They were told never to speak Japanese. They were very, very American. So they were two different kinds of people.
And so what kind of tension did that cause in the community?
Well, I don't know that the exact condition of the Kibeis in high school or in the community. I mean, obviously my mom had friends. They called her Iris rather than Ayame, but so she had both names. But I do feel that there over the years, there were bad feelings against the Kibei by the Nisei, especially after it was known that a number of the dissidents at Tule Lake, the pro-Japan people, were Kibeis. I mean, that's what they knew. So there was a tension, and going to the book Nono Boy by Okada, a very, very good fiction book about a guy that had been a Kibei dissident, it's shown that there was a lot of discrimination against them. They were hated. The ones that were of that ilk, that group, they were hated.
Did your parents send any your siblings or yourself to Japan, or did you go back to Japan when you were younger?
Yeah. So my parents, in the time when we were young, they didn't go back very many times. I mean, air travel was expensive and long distance calling was expensive. So I do want to point out that my dad never saw his parents again after he left at the age of 16.
Oh, wow.
He was in touch
with communication with them at all?
Well, he was considered disowned. But at the same time, he was close to his two uncles. So somehow, of course, the news went across. But so when I was in college, and actually at Scripps College in Claremont, California, my mom decided that I should come back to the UW because she found out about a cool study abroad program in Kyoto, which is a key cultural city. And I was already majoring in East Asian history in Claremont. So she said, why don't you come back? And there are these two really cool professors that are taking this study group to Japan. So I said, yeah, I'll do that. So it was a 1/4 long study group, but I stayed for an entire year. Those of us that refused to go back home, we stayed and did a lot of different interesting things in Japan. But so they were happy that out of the 4 kids that I was interested in that, and I had gone to Japanese school. 2 of us out of the 4 kids went to Japanese school, sort of were willing to study Japanese. And later, after I came back and went to the UW and became an activist and all that, my younger brother, Marcus, he also went to Japan in a similar study group from the University of Washington, but he ended up studying in a Zen temple in Kyoto. It was a very different experience than what I had.
Did your parents encourage all of you to become artists, or did they ever say, we want you to be an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor?
Well, okay, of my 3 brothers, because I don't consider myself an artist, I write about art and I know a lot about it and I have a lot of opinions about it, but I don't consider myself an artist. Of my 3 brothers, Deems is really brilliant, but he resisted the college education. And he and Jerry both didn't finish the university, but they're the two that became artists, true generative creative artists. Marcus is an orchestra conductor, symphony orchestra conductor. So he's a musician of many skills, and he has composed and arranged music. But I would say that Deems and Jerry are the two really individual artists. And Jerry worked for my dad. He was very skillful. He learned welding at a very young age in his teens. And my dad was starting to create the large fountain sculptures. He created 75 or 80 or more than that in US, Japan, and Canada. So Jerry was the assistant and eventually became the manager of these really major projects as my dad got older. So it wasn't surprising that he began to make his own sculptures and under the training and inspiration of my dad. And today he's a very successful sculpture artist. He's doing really, really well. And in the case of Deems, we all started music lessons at an early age, but he was determined, he was inspired by the funk and R&B of our age group. And he became a really successful jazz musician with his ensembles playing here and there and recording and getting airplay on the radio nationally. So he found his niche, and today he's still playing music, just waiting for that COVID to go away so that he can get some gigs again, because he was a very, very active performing artist up until last March.
Yeah, back in the day when I used to do a show called Celebrate the Differences on King with Mayumi Tsutakawa, we co-hosted the show, and Deems was I don't know what you call a regular, but we had him on probably every year because he was always willing to come on, and of course we paid nothing, but he loved the opportunity, and we always appreciated the fact that he jumped right on it. And Jerry, I know he did the Mitt, didn't he? Out at
Yes.
Yeah, the Mitt is the sculpture that is at it's safe, well, not Safeco anymore, but it is at the Mariners Stadium.
Yes.
And actually I remember he created some small mitts that
Yes.
that he would sell, and
Yes.
they always went for a lot of money.
Yeah. Well, bronze sculpture is expensive.
The work that you're doing now with this particular project, it's really it's detailing history. And why is that important?
Well, after I left the Washington State Arts Commission, where I had been the manager of grants for 14 years, I always had been interested in history and heritage, and I had a chance to jump into the Humanities Washington as a speaker, and I was trying to think of a topic that would be something that I would enjoy imparting. And so I decided to talk about Japanese American history and my family's history here, 100-year history here, because my grandfather came over in around 1904. So our family has had a long presence in Washington State. So I've always been interested in the Japanese American history and how we came to be, and the very dramatic political and social aspects of that. And so I've written about it, I've spoken about it, and I think it's just really important. When you talk to the people over at Densho, the Japanese American Archive, they will give you any number of reasons why it's important today to know about the terrible conditions and circumstances that led to the internment of 120,000 people, many, over half of whom were American citizens with no due process whatsoever. So I think that the history of Japanese Americans is really important, and we should keep teaching people about it. I spoke many times to crowds around Washington State where people say, I never heard about that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important things, particularly in these times, as we talk about issues of race and systemic racism, for particularly white America to understand the history of people of color in this country, and how we've been divided and really in many ways shunned, and yet to understand the privilege that they have had.
Yeah.
So I
I
think
mean,
that's
I think the internment of the Japanese Americans is probably the singular most important story of Asian Americans. And it doesn't get the play it should. It should be front and center always.
Mhm. Yeah,
because
very.
that in a way, look at the young migrant kids that have been that are lost, and we have done this to
Yeah.
young children and
Mhm.
separated them from families. So let's
Yeah.
not forget that. So I think that that's just very critical work. Were your parents, were they bitter about the camps at all?
Uh, the answer to this is a bit controversial. My mother was pretty naive. She didn't get a chance to graduate from high school, and she had been raised in a different country. She was kind of a star among the Japanese traditional performers at the camp, and she has been quoted as saying that she had a good time in camp. She has said that. And I think that she wants to stand up. She has pride in the fact that she was a leading student of Japanese traditional arts. She was very sheltered by her mother. Her mother was quite successful. Her mother was even the manager of one of the canteens, which were co-op stores. Every number of barracks or blocks, there were about 20 of them, and they had a lot of power because they bought and sold items. And there were even really expensive, good items like fresh fish, fresh produce, clothing, tools, and so on that they bought and sold. So my mother's position in camp was that of a kind of a privileged family, actually. So she has said, and this was in her later years, she has said that she did not have a bad time in camp. My dad, of course, had a completely opposite opinion, coming as a US citizen in a US Army uniform, visiting the camps and seeing his own relatives in terrible conditions, and some of them were deported. He was very, very sad about the war, but he was convinced that the US would win the war. He was in disagreement with her parents and other pro-Japan people, but he was successful as a teacher of Japanese language in the military and intelligence school, and came back to Seattle, finished his degree, or no, I think he already had his BA, and then he finished his graduate degree and became a faculty member at the UW. So I can't say that the wartime was bad for my dad.
The legacy of your family in the arts, particularly in this city, it's pretty tremendous. Uh, Actually, at King Television, where Matt and I worked, and he wasn't in the new building, well, the new building, which doesn't exist anymore, but your father had created a fountain that was in the kind of the atrium area at King TV, and I remember the opening for that. And I know that the Bullitt family, which then owned King, they really appreciated his work. But
One thing I want to mention about that is that, is it Patsy Collins?
yes, yeah, she was
Member
one
of
of
the
the
Bullitt
daughters,
family.
right?
Yeah, she has taken that fountain over to her place in
Oh, actually, that's Harriet.
Winthrop.
That's Harriet. Harriet Bullitt. Yeah,
Harriet, excuse me.
Harriet.
Okay,
this is-
Harriet
yeah.
Bullitt took it over there, and my brother Jerry reconfigured it so it is a sculpture located at Sleeping Lady,
Oh, wow.
the
Oh, wow. Yeah.
resort over in Leavenworth.
So the legacy lives on. Well, how do you feel about your family's just this legacy that you guys have? You're kind of like, in a way, one of the first families of the arts here in Seattle. Really?
Well, I want to point out that my grandfather was a Seattle pioneer. Don't look at the pictures of all the white people and say those are the true pioneers of Seattle. No, there are many other people, including leading Chinese citizens, that are the pioneers of Seattle. But okay, getting to your question, Yes, we did, especially after my dad started to do the large sculpture commissions in other cities, and many in Seattle, many sculptures. Um, and I want to point out that Wing Luke Museum is going to have a show of my brother Jerry's work opening this coming June, and there's going to be a lot of examples of my dad's artwork in that show. So please go and see that. So yeah, we received a lot of recognition, and each one of us had our own niche or area. And I mean, I was a reporter for the Seattle Times for 6 years, and so I think that my name became known. Marcus was one of the really famous conductors of high school musicians in this whole region, and was recognized nationally. Beams being a recording artist, and Jerry, sculptor. We really did receive recognition as individuals and also as a family. But I want to say that my mom was the one that really kept us together. And we all were really positively influenced by my dad, and my mom took care of him. He was 13 years older, so he died before she did, but she really took good care of him. And we, as a group, my mom passed away for 3 or 4 years ago, I forgot which, but we have an LLC, we have a family trust, and so we're taking care of the family home and the artwork, and deciding what to do with them.
You guys are an important part of the city and its history. And Mayumi, thank you so much for joining us and talking about your family and the work that you're doing, which I think is very important because you're chronicling the history. And I think that's something that needs to be done and to pass it down to the next generation. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Mayumi. And yeah, I'm looking forward to how your project comes together, because that's really that's a real interesting phenomenon in the Japanese community, the Kibei. So
Yeah.
Are you hoping to turn it into a book? I know you don't want
Yes,
to call it a book.
yes, I am. But I read so many books and I go, I don't know if I can do that.
it's okay. Have it a Netflix series.
Yeah.
There you go. All right.
So we can all
Can't
binge
wait.
it.
Okay. Good.
Mayumi Tsutakawa.
Thank you. Thanks
All
to
right.
both of you for your questions and your reception.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Take care.